All right, here we are. We're back to From the Belly. I'm really proud of the work that we've done. I'm proud of the last 20 some episodes, which is kind of the second iteration of From the Belly. My guest today is Dr. Davis Hankins. And Davis is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies and the Director of the Center for Judaic Holocaust and Peace Studies at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. Now, there's probably a lot of folks listening that don't know where Boone is. So, Davis, first of all, welcome to From the Belly.
Thanks so much, Doug. It's nice to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you, man. We got some really good things to talk about today. Where is Boone, North Carolina?
Boone is in the the western mountains, the northern part of the mountains of North Carolina. So about 2 hours across the ridge line from Asheville, up near the Virginia,
Oh,
Tennessee, North Carolina border. And it is a beautiful place, over 3,000 feet above sea level, and
wow.
got some of the highest peaks on the East Coast, right in our vicinity. So it's a wonderful, beautiful place to live. It's a regional master's level R2 university with about 22,000 students, and I teach all undergraduate students.
I'm kind of a sports nut. Is it Division two or one?
No, it's Division One.
Division one, right on. And is there a strong athletic program there, be it football, baseball, basketball,
Yes,
volleyball?
the yeah, the most attention for sure is with football, and they won. Appalachian State won three national titles when they were FSA,
Uh,
or what F. Anyway, the Division
right on.
two or whatever, and and so that really put football on the map big time
Mm,
at the school. And but I think our most successful sport has been wrestling. Historically, we're often in the
wow.
top 25 of the wrestling programs in the NCAA. But this year, maybe our most exciting story was we had a tennis player who made it to the final eight in the NCAA single brackets, and she was a great player. She beat the number one player in the country at one point this season. So anyway, that was a lot of fun to follow her
Gotta
NCAA
love
career.
that.
Yeah,
And how long have you been there at Appalachian State?
I've been here 15. This is my 15th year.
15th year. All right. Davis has a PhD from Emory University and MDiv from Columbia Theological Seminary, and he got his bachelor's degree at North Carolina State University. And I was curious, what was your undergraduate degree in?
It was actually in business, finance, and economic, and then in Greek. I
Wow.
had a minor in classical Greek.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so here's some of the courses, at least according to on your website of Appalachian State. Here's the courses that you teach, and correct us if any of them are wrong. Religions of the world, Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, New Testament, Judaism, biblical prophets, justice and hope. After Jesus, from Paul to Christianities, gender, sexuality in the Bible, critical theory and biblical texts, visual arts, sacred texts and religion, religious literature, and visual art. Man, I'll tell you what.
Yeah,
How many
that's the
Davis
beauty of teaching undergrads. You just get to teach all across the board.
how many Davis Hankins are there?
Yeah, there are opportunities to teach lots of courses here.
All right. This is your own words here. I study biblical literature, religion, and society in light of modern literary theory and philosophy. I'm currently writing a book on Jewish history and literature in the early Hellenistic period. I also continue to work on the book of Ecclesiastes and the history of its use and influence in Jewish, Christian, and other communities. Man, you edited 6 books for Walter Brueggemann, and we're going to be talking about your relationship with Walter, your work the two of you did together.
Yeah.
Have you edited other works other than Walter's work?
I did. I had edited a special issue of a journal once with two other colleagues, but no, not no other books.
Yeah. How did it come to be that you like the first book you edited for Walter?
Yeah.
Tell us what that book was, what year that was, and how did that come to be?
Well, I mean, it starts much earlier than that because I was Walter's student, and so we've had a relationship for, I mean, for 3 years or whatever, 24 years, somewhere in there. And but in 2000, I think it was 2013, Walter asked me. We had written a couple of articles together at that point, I think, and he asked me if I would be interested in putting together some of his recent lectures. He was often invited to give lectures at churches and universities and um,
Mm.
uh, different meetings, preachers, or all. It's really his. He was invited. It's amazing how many people and different kinds of intellectual communities he appealed to. But anyway, he had about 4 years of lectures from 2008 to 2012 that he thought would there might be a book in there. He said something like to that effect, and so I got
Mm.
all of these essays and tried to find the book that was in there and put it together, and that was published in 2014 with Baylor University Press. Ice Axis for Frozen Seas is the title. It's from a
Yeah, I don't have that one, man.
yeah, it's
What
from
a title.
a Kafka quote where he talks about books should be ice axes to break the seas frozen within us, and so it was my way of
Wow.
framing the kind of uh, radical and sort of destructive mode of some of Brueggemann's theology, political theology, especially.
Did you? So you came up with the title?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, they. In fact, the publisher didn't want to go with the title. They thought it was too obscure or whatever, and Walter insisted, to my enjoyment.
Can you remember the moment when you suggested it to Walter?
No, I don't. I don't remember that moment. But
Mm.
he liked that a lot, and he knew of the quotation. I think he
Mm.
even quoted it in an interview. I can't remember if this is before or after, but with Terry Gross, I think. Uh,
Oh wow.
yeah,
How
or
cool.
unless it was Krista Tippett, it was somebody.
I remember that interview with Kristen Tippett. They're sitting in those kind of lounge chairs, and she's nervous as all get out, and he's just as relaxed as can be. And she says something. I've gone back and I tried to find this. I didn't have time one time when I was looking for it, but she says something like, you're like the rock star of biblical scholars, and he had that laugh, right? He's just like, yeah, it was great.
Yeah,
He didn't deny it though.
yeah.
He didn't deny it.
So that started. Then 4 years later, I did the same. I mean, I did the same thing for the next basically 4 years of his writings, where I put together a book out of lectures that he had given. And
Hmm.
then I was contacted by Westminster John Knox Press and Walter about the possibility of doing a series that they called the Walter Brueggemann Library. And that was a very different type of editing. And there are 4 books in that series. So those are the 6 books. So, yes, 6 books from 2014 to 2024 is when the last one came
Wow.
out in the Walter Brueggemann Library, which will be the end of them. But for those, I chose themes and then tried to find things that Walter had published before that centered around those themes in some interesting ways that illuminated central parts of his work, I think. So um, that was 4 volumes and out of 4. So that series has run its course at the publisher.
So Walter died on the 5th of June
Hmm.
of this year. Uh, Davis, you spoke at the memorial service in Traverse City at the Methodist Church there, I think Central Methodist Church. I had the privilege to, when I did my first podcast from the Belly, I'd mentioned that to you. I called Walter up and said, "Would you be my first guest?" And he said, "I absolutely will." And I said, "Well, how about if I fly to Traverse City?" Um, I thought I was a little forward in my own invitation, but I went for it. And he said, "That's fine. And where will we do it?" And I said, "I'll find a little studio." And we did. I picked him up at his house and we drove to this small house and it looked like, oh man, I don't know the quality of the recording. I'm not sure. We walked in, it was like state of the art.
Wow.
So we sit down at this little table, and the gentleman had it all set up, and he's got these 2 mics, and so I'm about maybe 4 feet from Walter at this little table, and I got so many notes. I needed like, a 20-foot desk just to be able to put. I was so nervous, man. And he just sitting there, and he's just like ready to go. And I'm looking right at him and I'm thinking, I am totally, totally blank. I mean, I don't remember who I am, who he is, where we are. So we did the daggone thing. So that was Traverse City. So I know a little bit about that place. And it was an honor because he and Tia invited me to church. I
Mm.
stayed at a local hotel and I was able to take communion with Walter,
Oh, wow.
which it was just like, man, wow. And it was a period of time in my life spiritually where I had gone from communion was like really central to my faith life. And it had gone because of my brother's death and some other things that Walter knew about. It had gone to, I wouldn't have gone to church and I wouldn't have taken communion, but to have that opportunity to go with Walter. I've returned to my faith in a new iteration of my own faith, and I credit Walter for doing that. He said something to me over lunch. Uh, we say these things that changed my life. This changed my life. I watched this movie. It changed my life. This human being changed my life. It changed my life, man. What he said to me,
Mm.
and we never talked about it ever afterwards. I never said, "Hey, you changed my life," and didn't need to. You spoke at his eulogy on the 19th, and it really stood out what you said and the way you presented it and the whole deal. Um, But here's the way you referred to meeting Walter in 2002. That was your first inroad into Columbia Seminary. And you said, I was barely out of my teens. So I started doing the math, going, okay, I think I might know how old
Uh-huh.
Davis is. Davis, what was it like for you to go from being in his class, maybe that freshman year and maybe all through that seminary experience? What was it like to transition from that to actually be a colleague of his, suggesting things to him? You probably didn't do too much of that as his student,
Right.
you know.
Right.
But what was that like for you personally to make that transition?
Well, it, I can't really overstate how important he's been in my life and shaping the whole direction of my uh, professional life, but also he has been just wonderful personally to me and my family. As after I left Columbia, I mean, well, first you asked about the experiences of being in that classroom with him. I mean, that was transformative and really put me on the direction of wanting to pursue Old Testament studies at an advanced level, um, and so he thankfully stayed around Columbia after he retired, and taught some classes. He would teach a D-Min class here or there. He still kept his office or study, as he insisted you would call it, a study, not an office, because an office is where you write memos, and a study is where pastors and scholars do their work. So he kept his study, and I was his research assistant and worked with him on a couple of books for those couple of years after he officially retired, and I was still at Columbia. And then when I went to pursue my PhD work, I was just down the road in Atlanta at Emory University.
Mm,
So, uh, staying close with him, we continued to have coffee or meet and discuss coursework. And uh, there
mm,
were a group of people that had studied with Walter who went on and got their PhD and became scholars in the field. And so there's a whole. He was very good at cultivating the next generation and inviting people to eat meals with him and giving
mm,
books
mm.
away. So when he did move offices, I got a bunch of his books from him that he,
Oh boy.
yeah. And so then once I finished at Emory and I got the job here in Boone, I was married at that point and had a 2 year old when we moved.
Mm,
And my wife was she had our second child right after we moved here. And we continued to be in touch both personally and professionally. He was very he came to visit us in Boone. We went to visit them in Cincinnati multiple times, and then also I
mm,
went to Traverse City a lot. So we really made efforts to visit one
mm,
another, and he was super sweet with my children in sort of a grandfatherly way. And it was he's been personally as well as professionally profoundly important. But
mm,
so it was sort of seamless to go to answer your original
mm,
question from because I stayed in Atlanta, and then
mm,
we stayed in touch and then began writing together. So one of my first articles that I ever published is co-authored with him, and it's still one of my favorite
Mm,
pieces. And I had a similar experience to you interviewing him, of just kind of uh, not believing that I was going to be, on the byline with Walter Brueggemann.
mm, mm. Thank you, Davis. You said in your eulogy on the 19th of July of this year, you said Walter taught us, let's say, at Columbia Seminary. He taught but never tried to explain the inexplicable. That stood out to me. Would you say a few things about that?
Yes. Yeah, this aspect of the Bible, of literature, is hugely important to Walter. That is uh, that that there's something that remains inscrutable, or sometimes he talks about it as a negativity, or God's unpredictability, or God's in the biblical God's tendency to fail, or to um, go
Hmm.
too far, or what have you. He always was drawing attention to these places where the fundamentally something like God, or ontology, he would say, the nature of being, is something that we just can't touch and can't know. This is the role of the sort of epistemological reflections on postmodernism that you find across his writings, where all we have are particular local narratives and perspectives, and there remains something negative. There remain cracks, places where the texts don't fit together, places where
Hmm.
the the God of the text is surprising, and in ways that aren't uh, explained. And Walter was also deeply influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis, and so I think behind
Yes.
this also is a real sense of how the unconscious works, and there's a kind of unconscious dimension to the biblical text, where you have God in the nouns and verbs and adjectives and the statements about God, and that's how the Bible, on the one hand, delivers God to you, but there's this other way that he always is pointing out in his writings, which is in these moments where things don't fit together, where there's an absence, a crack, a break, or something surprising and something inexplicable. He would not see that as something that needed to be explained, but instead as a revelation of truth, of the truth of the God that um, he would describe as in, with, and under the biblical text and nowhere else. But exactly
Mm.
where that God is not, it's not always in the positive statements, the constructive statements, normative statements about God. God, he was always pointing out how God was showing up in these negative, or the inexplicable.
Mm. Oh, there's so much there, isn't there? Um, did I read this correctly in the biography that was written recently? What's it called? Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination. Did I read correctly? I was going to go look this morning, but I thought I probably won't find it. That Walter said, um, "There's no God outside the text." Did I read that right?
Yes, that's right. That's another way of saying what I just said, which is that the God
Hmm.
of the Bible is in, with, and under the biblical text and nowhere else. This is a statement that he said, and that generated all kinds of controversy.
Yes.
So he even said, I think, at some point, that he regretted writing that sentence, but then he went on to write very similar sounding sentences elsewhere, and so I don't think that he regretted it. There's another recent book on Walter's work by Robert Williamson, who is a very good, I think, interpreter of Walter's works. It's called Reading the Bible with Brueggemann, and he had pointed this out, that Walter had said he regretted saying it, and then kept saying it. So yeah.
I'm thinking about those two realities, if you will. Let's say they're both genuine. He apologizes for saying it, but he can't stop from, let's say, believing it, right, and writing it. Does that speak to Walter's sensitivity to how he related to people? Like he didn't want to. I'm going to translate it, and you tell me if this is correct. I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to cause conflict. I'm not trying to create dissension among people, but I will continue. And this other Walter Brueggemann, that this is what I believe. This is what I have to write. Does that
Mm-hmm.
kind of describe him? Because when I first met him, I was really I picked him up with a friend of mine who was a big Walter reader and fan, and we were both really nervous about picking Walter up. I'd spoken to him on the phone, but I never met him, and I just said to my friend Denny, "It's like I don't know what to expect, but is he going to like kind of roar when he's with us?
He was,
Is he going to be really,
yes,
And he was so. I mean, the way he related to my young son in the car and whatever, it was just like, well, I don't understand these two
right.
worlds.
Yes, he was so caring and pastoral and sensitive and gentle. And then he would get up and give these booming lectures with, all of the pyrotechnics going on in the background. And then his writings are forceful and with such conviction
Forceful.
that, yeah, yeah, it doesn't, lots of people I think are surprised upon having personal, um, interpersonal
Mm,
interactions with Walter, especially if
with
all they
Walter.
knew were him in this public
That's right.
persona
That's
in the
right.
publications.
Mm. You also said, no, let's see, did you say this in your eulogy or did I read it somewhere else? Um, that he taught us how to read the Bible. And what I'm interested in is I want to hear about that and what that actually means. But I want to hear about how you in your life and in your writings and in your work and you're handling the text. This how to read the Bible. What does that mean?
Okay,
What did Walter teach, and what do you live by?
that's a great question, and it's one we could approach in a couple of different ways that I'm thinking about. But one thing that he would do in his classes, which is pretty simple, is lay out and he does it. There's a book where he lays out this sort of three steps of how to read the text. He was trained as what's
Mm,
called a rhetorical critic, so he's always paying attention to formal features and repetitions and resonances between uh, within a narrative and or poetry. And so he would say the first thing that you should do when approaching a text is map it. Just map it. And so that was something that many of his students were like, "What do you mean map it? How do you map the?" But he would come up with all these chalkboard drawings with the text, and then this word is connected to that word, and that word repeats, and this word is a sort of binary opposite
mm,
of that, and then this, he would walk he would map out the text. And so paying attention to not just what the text says, but how it says what it says, and how that should guide your reading, your understanding, your interpretation of the text. And then he would talk about pursuing key words. And so the map should show you these sort of nodal points in the text that you should then
mm,
pursue, because that's going to be where something important uh, is to be found. And then he always asks a question about then, so in whose interests does this text serve? So from a sort of perspective, a
mm,
critique of ideology and that kind of political dimension that is throughout Walter's works, that is in addition to and never separate from his attention to the literary and rhetorical features of the text. And so anyway, that is a basic, like what he would offer as a basic, steps of how do you read the text. You map it, pursue some keywords, and the map is often turned around little conjunctions and particles, and just all the little features of the text were significant and
mm.
meaningful, like a great rabbi. And reading the text was Walter. And so, and then asking the question about ideology and vested interest sometimes opens up for him onto history and historical, sociological issues, but at other times is more about contemporary readers and the historical moment that they're in.
Um, I've had people. I didn't know Walter the way you knew him. I want to be very clear on that. What I had was very precious to me, but quantitatively, uh, and even probably qualitatively, but quantitatively doesn't match. But it's still what I had, and I'm deeply grateful for it. So people will ask me, um, So tell me, what did Walter not mean by this, but what did Walter believe about X, Y, and Z? And one of the questions that's often asked to me is, um, for example, did Walter believe in the resurrection, the literal resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus? And did Walter live with some notion that Jesus was going to return? What else? Not so much about inerrancy of oh yeah, another one would be, so somebody asked me this recently. So I'm listening to kind of some new theological scholar folk, and they're going, hey, and we all, maybe if we've been around this long enough, hey, the Gospels aren't reliable, and the Old Testament's, it's everybody talks about it like it's old, but it's really not that old in relationship to literature that was written before it that presupposes it. So there's really nothing unique about it. It's not like the sacred text. So first of all, let's talk about that resurrection piece. Do you know how would I translate that to people, or does it not even matter? Because I never asked Walter. I had one person say, "Okay, I want you to ask him." I'm like, "Dude, I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that." But do you mind speaking to that for a moment? Those topics.
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak directly to what Walter
Yeah.
believed or didn't because, like you and most people, I don't. Yeah, I wouldn't have pressed him to make a kind of
Yeah.
claim about any of that. But um, but one thing he did do throughout his work was to push against theological categories that have become so important in Christian biblical interpretation, and instead insist on the nouns, verbs, and adjectives that we have in the Bible for God. And then, so in his big theology of the Old Testament, that's the main section of what he calls Israel's core testimony about God, is where he takes these nouns like judge and creator, or actions like creation and sustaining work, and and then adjectives about God as uh, faithful and with steadfast love and mercy and blah blah blah, and yet just. And so Walter really pushed, I think, tried to push people away from the dominant theological categories, which of course in an earlier moment in history were like the omnis for God, omni this and omni that,
Mm.
and instead into the particularities of biblical texts, where he thought that there was much more positive potential for encountering the biblical God and understanding the biblical God and having relationships and communities centered around that biblical God, so that you then would talk about God as loving creator, or uh, inscrutable uh, force of destruction in the world, or whatever, however the biblical God is talked about, from text to text, and not by forcing, or not by sort of cutting off the edges and undermining what the biblical text says to make it speak in theological terms that aren't at home with the biblical literature.
And how does this, knowing the influence that Walter had on you, how does this live in you and for you right now as you you teach at Appalachian State? It's not a Christian school per se, and you teach. It sounds like you said it's undergrad work and whatever. And
Mm.
so, how have you found a life there for yourself, and even outside of there, in your own writings? Have clearly been influenced by Walter, but you're your own person, and he would always want you to be, right.
Mm.
So, how what's happening for you in the place that you have been for 15 or 16 years? And then you become recently, I don't know the date, but you became the director of the how do I pronounce
Judaic
that?
Holocaust and Peace.
Thank you, man.
Yeah.
Judaic. And that's at Appalachian State.
Hmm.
So tell us about that in regards to what's alive for you, and how are you making your way in the world as a scholar?
Yeah, well, it is different. Walter always taught seminary students, and I got to teach at a couple of different uh, in a couple of different seminary classrooms when I was in Atlanta, still finishing my graduate work. I taught at the Interdenominational Theological Center, and I taught some courses at Candler School of Theology. at Emory while I was in the graduate program, uh, and I really liked teaching seminary students, and that was a long time ago now, um, but I think still you often have in seminary classrooms students that are there, especially in biblical classes. They want to learn because they want to again carry on and do
Hmm.
professional ministry, and they
That's
need
their
to know
thing.
something
Yeah.
about the Bible if you're going to be a Christian minister. So um, it is very different at Appalachian State, where like the title, a state university, it's a state school, it's part of the UNC system, and so
Mm.
it's um, it's teaching biblical literature in a public school, but there's something really, I think, different and unique about that because unlike in a seminary context or a synagogue uh, Torah study or in a uh, Sunday school classroom, you're reading the Bible in a different place when you're reading it at a public university. And
Mm.
it's
Interesting.
even for people who take the Bible to be sacred and authoritative scripture and so on. I find that they really enjoy uh, not having to think so much about how this text relates to that other text in a way that will cause problems for some doctrinal commitment or dogmatic
Mm.
belief, but instead the ability to walk in the classroom and kind of put that stuff aside and try and really confront the Bible for what's there. And then the students who, of course, most students I think do not see the Bible that way in my classrooms as sacred or holy scripture, and they're most interested then in learning, well, what is in the Bible and what is not in the Bible, because Moses seems
Mm.
familiar, but it might be because I know Moses through all these other ways and I have no idea what's in the actual biblical text. So I've enjoyed my time teaching these students at Appalachian State. And there's a real culture here at this university around sustainability and being in the mountains and um, the Appalachian uh,
Mm.
context that I think is really
Context.
beautiful and important and not unrelated to uh, Jews in American history, and the center has been around since 2003. I just started directing it um, over a year ago, and
Mm.
it's prime. We have a minor, so we have some coursework with affiliated faculty do, and we have events throughout the year. But the main thing that the center does is to bring in middle and high school teachers in the summer to get continuing ed
Wow.
credit and learn. These are either English or history teachers, and then we bring in Holocaust educators and scholars, and so this group of teachers,
Mm.
and it's all funded by the center um, and a grant the center has through the Jewish Claims
Hmm.
Against Germany conference in Germany. Um, and so we bring in 35 to 40 teachers every summer, and they give up a week of their summer, but they get a week in the beautiful mountains where it's 70 degrees, and they get to get really concrete, helpful uh, understanding of Holocaust studies right now, and also pedagogical practices for how best to teach these difficult concepts and ideas and this difficult moment in history to mostly high schoolers, although we do have some middle school history and English teachers as well. But that's been a rewarding part of the last year. We
Yeah.
had a terrible hurricane here a year ago as
Oh
well,
yes. Oh yes. I was going to ask you about that.
which was really devastating. And so that was shortly after I started directing the center, and so everything was on hold. It was a somewhat odd year to be
Hmm.
canceling all these things that we had planned. And anyway, but it was a beautiful moment too of people of a community coming together in support of each other and really caring. It's funny. We had the year anniversary this fall, and I had many memories flooding back to me of how often you would. I mean, whenever you saw anybody, your first question was, how are you? How's your house?
Mm.
How's it? What happened? Did you have
Treasure.
any? I mean,
Mm.
so many people had damage that you just assumed that everybody had something that they went through and could you help, and just to go through the world being primarily concerned about other people was a real lesson for me, and how often that's not how we're oriented in the world,
Yes.
me included. So um,
Yeah, we go back to some other norm, don't
yeah,
we?
we do.
It's kind of like COVID
Yep.
too. I mean, you think about it. If somebody coughed a little bit or whatever, it's like, wow, how are you?
Yes.
You doing okay? I mean, do you have COVID or whatever? I mean, the aftermath of that, I I was with somebody recently. They had a little cough, and I was free enough to go. Man, have you done a COVID test? And they're like,
Yeah.
no. And I went, wow, we're like post COVID, aren't we?
Yeah.
But not.
Yeah. And and the hurricane was so different here because, and I thought about this in relation to the COVID, because in COVID you wanted to care for your neighbors by not interacting with them, by staying isolated, by engaging
Mm.
in conversations like this, podcasts, or Zoom calls or whatever. And so it was. But then in the hurricane, after the hurricane hit, my kids didn't go back to school for a month. You the roads were
Wow.
closed, bridges are out. There was no internet at first. There's no electricity. So it was
Wow.
the only way to connect with people was to get out and be with them in person. So the hurricane sort of drove the community together, even as it cut us completely off from outside uh,
Mm.
you
Yeah, it was
sources
so
of
local, wasn't
information.
it?
Yeah, because we didn't have the internet, and so we didn't have any
Dude.
information or So um, anyway, it was two very different experiences from two pretty major crises in the last 4 years that um, bring just very different lessons for how to care for neighbors, and when the kinds of constraints that exist, how that'll lead to different kinds of care. Yeah.
Have you seen that kind of what we'll call maybe a deeper and extended form of care? Have you seen that continue on? Like, has that changed that community that you're in, at least for what your lifetime will be? Do you have a sense that
Yeah, it's a
it
good
will?
question. I think probably in many ways things have gone back, but there have been really beautiful moments, especially around the year anniversary, of just reminders of how many people did so much,
Mhm.
that there's so much that I don't even know what people were doing, and I just find out
Right,
like a year
right.
later, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
all these people were doing that other thing that I didn't, I thought I knew kind of what was going on because I was at the distribution center and I was, in the middle of stuff. And um but yeah, I think it did change some
Mm-hmm.
people, especially individuals. uh
Mm-hmm.
and we played a my one of my children goes to the high school, and we played Asheville High School in a sporting event this fall at Asheville, and they had a whole out of like a ceremony, I guess, and talking about and honoring certain people for their involvement in the
Wow.
response to the
Wow.
hurricane, and sort of celebrating from one end of North Carolina mountains to the other, because Asheville is sort of west and south in the state, and we're more north and east of the mountain, as the mountain range goes. And uh, and so anyway, it was a very really touching, beautiful um, moment to recognize how many people did so much. And so at those moments, you do feel a deeper connection where you're about to have a sports
Mm.
competition. And what's most important is what's said at the very beginning, which is how that football field or soccer field was used as a main place for
Wow.
helicopters to drop off all the stuff. And anyway, just and hearing those stories again, you do feel a little bit of distance as time passes from
Yeah.
those immediate realities, but it is something that now you do know what it feels like to have lived in that way with those people, and of course many people are still going through the consequences and effects of that. But
Um, and yeah, to your point, things reset back to some sense of normal. I mean, we could talk about that and how it's maybe more abnormal than normal. Maybe that time was more normal, meaning not because of the crisis, just because of the connection. But I'm also thinking about the power of you just telling me. You're telling an oral story, and so the story continues on. And I'm imagining for eons of time people will carry this story on, even if somehow they've returned back to malls and phones and internet and all those things. And we could talk all day about is that good for us or not, but it is what it is. But these oral stories continue on. It reminds me of the biblical text. It's like these stories continue on, and that God is somehow in all that, because if there's no God outside the text, then there's no other God but the God who's involved with all of this uh, at the most intimate details. which is just hard to fathom. And many times in my mind doesn't line up with the reality of, yeah, but I got this crisis and I got this crisis and I got this death and I got this. And I'm just like, and that was one of the conversations that I alluded to earlier. It's like, there's no God in that. And I kind of said something like that in the presence of Walter. I was kind of in my head about him. I mean, he didn't correct me, but he said something that guided me back to,
Mm.
no, my faith, my experience of God, I have to take that back into consideration. I was also thinking, Dallas, Davis, when you were talking about these students that you have, and when you're talking about Moses, for example, here's what I'm imagining is that when you're in a church context, you're in a seminary context, we all have these loyalties to Moses, or we have these loyalties to Elisha, is one of these biblical characters that I'm really struck by. Elijah, I mean, you can't have Elisha without Elijah, and I know this is one of your special areas because I said, man, you and I offline, outside of podcast, if I could have coffee or beer with you, I'd like to talk to you about Elisha. But we have these loyalties to what we think these biblical characters are. But I mean, the freedom of people who don't have the loyalties. They just have, okay, Moses, maybe grandpa talked about him or something and whatever. And they don't have any skin in the game to try to have to hold on to a loyalty. They're more open and free. So then I think about the more we get formed, it's kind of like, does it actually become a barrier to just being open to?
Mm.
So this God of the Old Testament is just wild as ever. And I found this in my own journey. I spoke, and friends know I've returned to a new iteration of my faith, and I'm back in church and whatever. But there's times where I just go, okay, I'm back, but I don't seem to have the same freedom to talk about a God who I didn't like not too long ago.
Mm.
And it just opened me to be able to go, I don't care honestly if I'm incorrect about this or if I am somehow offending God. I don't care right now. And I was able to speak freer. So I'm trying to make those two worlds live together, to integrate those so I can be as free as one of your students who goes, I don't give really a damn about Moses, but tell me about
Uh-huh.
Moses. You
Yeah,
know what I
yeah,
mean? Does that make
yeah, it
sense?
does.
And it tells us something about you. If that's a place that you found and I'm assuming that you're really energized by that audience that you have. It tells us something about you that maybe is why you're even there and why you're thriving there and why you're supposed to be there. Those are all the questions that I always ask out of let's see, that would be out of the left brain. Where am I supposed
Mm.
to be? And then my right brain or somebody else will be, well, you're supposed to be right where you are. And I'm just like, okay, I'm going to see if I can abide in that space for longer than I do. Where am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah,
Um,
and it's true. I do think
yeah,
I really enjoy those. So most of the students I teach will take one religion class, and that'll be probably the only religion class that they take. So that
mm,
I do like that population of students, and then I do get to teach some of those other courses you mentioned earlier are upper level courses, and we teach a large number of students, but we have very few majors, and so our upper level classes are small seminars with lots of close reading, and at this moment in history that seems to be something disappearing largely from people's experiences, is the joy of reading something closely and being able to increasingly students are
yeah,
having a hard time working through just what I would think of as pretty normal length article with basic thesis that is being supported in pretty clear ways, and students are increasingly having a harder and harder time doing that. And I think that sounds make me sound like a grumpy old professor who's like, professors are always complaining about students who aren't as good as they were before. But I do think that there's something different at this moment with people who have been born into never knowing a world without the iPhone and with social media and the image dominant. Anyway, I do think it's complicated and there's a lot more to it than I know about, but I do know that the upper level courses also bring me a lot of energy and Students, in some cases, it brings them, I think, new experiences of the joy of reading texts closely and arguing about them, or trying to think differently than how they did on a first reading about a text. And so those kind of seminar classes are also really fun, and we have a good group of, although it's small, but a good group of majors here too.
Wow, it sounds like you're in the best place you can be right now. Before I'm looking at the time, and I want to be sensitive to both of our times and to the listening audience to maybe work with less is more. Um, but before I drop into something that I need to stay true to something that I want to talk to you about and get your opinion on, and hopefully I can make some sense of it, and you can help me make sense of it. But before I do that, um, what comes up for you when somebody asks, okay, I see that you are the director of this Judaic center and Holocaust studies, and having these people come in this learned environment, and high school teachers being exposed to all of that. And so if we think of that as the academy for a moment, um, somebody asks you, so what do you make of what's going on in the Middle East? I mean, and what I mean by that is not so much the history of it, but um, what's going to become of this? What do you sense in your imagination
Gosh,
with the
yeah.
evidence that we have? What's going to become of what's happening? I go to an American Baptist church, and one of the cool things that we do here is that we have on Sunday morning we have a time where uh, our senior pastor Erica Marksberry, who, by the way, often when she's preaching, I think, wow, Walter would dig this. He would dig this. We have a time where she reads prayers that people have written during the service, and she just reads them, um, eyes wide open. We're just listening. Man, does it have an effect? I mean, of course, it's not in chronological order of good news and bad news. It's all mixed together. So, death of somebody and celebrating somebody's recovery of 25 days and yada, yada, yada. But every time, and it might be the same person in the congregation of about 100 and some people that meet, but there's always prayers for Gaza and Sudan and maybe one other, but I like that must be the same person or the same family. But what do you want to say, Davis, about how you sit with what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, it's heartbreaking, and it is very complicated, and I don't know what the
Yeah.
future looks like. Of course, nobody does. But if people care about Israelis and Palestinians, then it this is deeply concerning for many, for many reasons. The situation, um, and I know also in the United States from Jewish friends and neighbors that there's lots of
Yeah.
anxiety
Yes.
about rising acts of anti-Semitism, and worry about how easily the line can get crossed between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, and how quickly those two can blend into one another, even if I think it's
Yes.
important to say that they are not the same thing. Um, so I don't know. I don't have a good answer for this,
Yeah.
and I just know
Yeah.
that I hear often about deep anxiety from people living in this country who are Jewish, who didn't think that this country would be a place that felt so
Mm,
threatening to them. They thought that the
mm,
United States was a place that was going to uh, where this wasn't. They weren't going to have to face what is being perpetrated against Jewish communities and
mm,
individuals increasingly. So yeah, it's just a very difficult moment in history.
mm. Yes. Anything else you want to say about that before we maybe shift back to a little bit of Walter, but what I want to do, well, first of all, let me not get ahead of myself. Anything else that you want to say about the school's work,
No, no. Let's.
the redeeming work that your center's doing?
Um, well, the center's great, and by the way, not funded by state funds, so it's fully supported by grants and
Mhm.
donations, um, and does a number of really, I think, great things. And but we let's move on and talk about more. To return to Walter, if you have more. Yeah,
Okay, okay. You
yeah,
good with that? And I really want to plumb your, and by the way, folks, um, this is I think it's the 21st or 22nd episode in this new theme we've been into, this title, Why Not Church, or maybe Why Church? Um, and of course, what Davis and I are talking about today applies to that. But I titled this, and I should have said it in the beginning, but I titled this Plumbing a Wee Bit, and I have it in parentheses, Plumbing a Wee Bit of the Thoughts of Walter Brueggemann, just a wee bit. I love, by the way, in your eulogy that you said, I only edited 6 books. And we all knew what you meant by that, amongst like 100 and
yeah,
some or more. It's just like, man, I mean, how in the world uh, people that are that productive, and this might even apply to you, it's just, maybe it applies to me at times. People just go like, "Did you
yeah,
sleep? I mean, do you sleep? Do you eat? Do you hydrate? I mean, what do you do? How many lives do you have?"
yeah.
Um, so I really like to set this up for the next few minutes. I don't know if it'll work this way, but tell me, I'll set the table for it. It's a conversation with you and Walter. I want to think of it that way. Um, and it's a book that I didn't know about, but found at a small Presbyterian church in the Seattle area where I used to live. And by the way, I'm not going to name the church because I didn't steal it from their library, but I realized I checked it out and never returned it. So I need to return it. But it was written 9 years before you showed up at Columbia Theological Seminary. So it predates your exposure to Walter. And by the way, when you showed up as a freshman, did you know anything about Walter? Had you read anything? Did you know
Very little,
anything?
almost not.
Very, very little. All right, man. I mean, you were young too, right? How old were you when you showed up in
21.
2002?
Well,
You're
I was
21
turning
years
22
old.
right then, but born in
Okay.
1980.
And were you quite a scholarly chap in high school and your undergrad? I mean, were you?
Not I would say I became better and better at school in over the years, and yeah, yeah, but it took me a while to figure out what I was interested in, and
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, but my bet is the resources were on board for you to become who you've become and will continue to be, um, the scholar in the work that you're doing. So the book, and I'm sure you know it, Texts Under Negotiation.
yeah,
And it's a book that a lot of people, a lot of Walter Brueggemann fans, and this is probably true for most people who are readers because he wrote so much, is that people go, I never even heard of that
yeah.
book.
That,
I shared it with a friend the other day. He's like, I never heard of that book. I got to read that one. I'm like, yeah, add it to your
yeah,
list. The Bible and Postmodern Imagination. Now, there's a piece in this that I want to ask your opinion, and I want you to think about. And I don't want to jumble it up with a dialogue between you and Walter, and I don't want to force that as a back and forth. But you can think about being in dialogue because I'm going to ask you, what do you think Walter meant by this? And as a therapist, I'm very interested in this. And doing pastoral care work, I'm very interested in this. But I'm also interested in your thoughts on it and what actually it means for you if it resonates. Now, as I was looking over this morning, I know whenever you give a presentation or whenever even you do a podcast, you don't want to read too much because when you go, hey, I got something to read, and then you read on for like 5 minutes, and it's kind of like, no, man, don't do that. So I started looking at this and I thought, okay, I'm going to take little excerpts of maybe 500 words out of one of these chapters. And I couldn't do it because, and you would know this better than anybody. The way Walter wrote is the way Walter thought. And I thought, I can't just take an
Mm.
excerpt. I can't just go, oh, I could grab that and cherry pick that. It's like, no, you got to read this in context. Maybe back to, as you said, he would map this whole thing, and maybe I was trying to unmap his
Mm.
thinking. It's like, can't do that. So would you mind if I read a
No.
little bit? Wonderful. It's about what he referred to here, and you'll know if even some of the work that you did with Walter and your relationship with him. He refers to the zone of imagination,
Yes.
and I found that, and he's got that italicized. And I know enough about his writing, and it's like that's an emphasis. So here I go. I'm going to read for a few minutes, and then we'll talk for a few minutes. Each of us in the practice of texts has a zone of imagination that stands between the input of the text and the outcome of attitude, belief, or behavior. That is, no treatment of a biblical text moves directly from input to outcome. Anyone who imagines a direct move assumes a neat process and a kind of authority that is not, in fact, available. That zone of imagination is, of course, in part shaped by the community. But in fact, the personal zone of imagination is a protected place of intimacy and interiority that I keep for my very self, and no one else has access to it. I may on occasion share that interiority with my beloved, my pastor, my therapist, but only rarely and hardly ever fully. I went, oh, that's interesting. I don't want to say, I just want to keep reading because I got comments with every sentence. So I'm not going to do that. It is my quintessential locus where I, Walter Brueggemann, receive, process, and order all kinds of input that heals and assaults, that subverts and transforms. And I take into it and handle what I'm able as I am able. Now, it's interesting. I will say this, and I found this in Walter's writings. There's humility there, but he's also referencing, I know myself, but not
Mm-hmm.
fully. And I'll never fully know myself, but I'll continue to know myself. I find that to be so freeing and so important to know as we deal with self. It is a place that will not be forced, but works at its own pace. It is that operation of receiving, processing, and ordering that transpires when my mind wanders in listening to a text, a reading, in praying, or at any other time. In that wondrous, liberated moment, I take the material and process it in ways that are useful to me, about which I know. About this zone of imagination, I make three observations. I'm about done. And then I have my
Okay.
question to you. He says three observations. A, it is not in the moment of receiving a text empty and unoccupied. It is already a busy, occupied, teeming place, so that the new stuff of the text must mingle, interact with, and compete against what is already there in me, in Walter, in me, in you, Davis. What is already there is complex. I suggest three characteristic dimensions of the material already at hand. First, and he puts this in parentheses or italics. First, there are powerful vested interests of mine, about some of which I know. There is no disinterested reception of a text. I regularly have keen antennae to notice how a text touches my vested interest. Second, my vested interest is laid over my deep fears, and he has deep fears italicized, which have long, mostly independent careers. My deep fears have long, mostly independent careers. And third and last, underneath my fears, driving my fears, and shaping my interests are old, deep, unresolved hurts. I do believe that the hurt lies at the bottom of my imaginative apparatus. It can, of course, be argued, and this is what I want to ask you about. So let me read that again. I do believe that the hurt lies at the bottom of my imaginative apparatus. It can, of course, be argued that this proposed content of the zone is all negative, and one must lay alongside it the great power of hope and joy. It can, of course, be argued that this proposed content of the zone is all negative because of what he just went over, these powerful vested interests of mine, these deep fears, these unresolved hurts. So he says, my judgment, however, is that our unresolved negativities exercise a more powerful and finally decisive influence upon our capacity to receive and imagine than any positive counterpoint. What is Walter talking about when he says, my judgment, however? So he's saying it's not laying alongside this great power of hope and joy. My judgment, however, is that our unresolved negativities exercise a more powerful and finally decisive influence upon our capacity to receive and imagine than any positive counterpoint. What is he talking about?
Um, that is a wonderful book, I think, and a beautiful um, account of the human psyche from Walter, who's obviously from that description deeply influenced, I think, by Freudian psychoanalysis, and believes, like Freud did, that trauma lies at the heart of the formation of the unconscious. That what later folks, and Walter will also be deeply influenced by folks around like Jacques Lacan, who brought linguistics into the discussion of Freudian psychoanalysis, so that the fundamental trauma was entry into language in some ways, and how we all receive who we are and our identity from outside of ourselves. And so there's this fundamental hurt and trauma at the core of the human psyche, and that will ensure that we never know ourselves fully, as he says earlier in the passage, because he maintains, is going back even earlier to our discussion about he maintains this role, I think, of negativity and the unconscious, both for the biblical God and for the interpreters and the interpretive community, and thinks that there's a truth to that. It's not simply a negativity that one should get away from, but is in fact revealing, and as he says here, maybe even driving our best. So again, this is a very Freudian way of
Yeah.
thinking about cultural products and interpretation and meaning as being arising and out of um, people who are hurt and neurotic, um, and as a result have deep-seated fears that they rarely confess to others. Um, and on top of that, then the third layer that you mentioned, the first one, he talks about vested interests, which would just be my
Yes.
position in a class society, or in a racialized society, or in other ways that uh, I and others stand to benefit or not from interpretation and engagement with biblical literature. So I think what Walter's talking about is that none of us come to the biblical text like from a neutral perspective or clean, and we all come with deep hurts, and that these deep hurts that are the basis of our fears, and that uh, can result in various vested interests, that these all of that together, we need to be aware of what those are to the extent that we can for us and our perspectives, and then not just dismiss them as things that we need to get away from, because they can in fact be the driving impulse behind our most hopeful, creative, imaginative readings.
I'm thinking of wound and
Mm,
medicine. So if that's my brain is forming those two kind of domains. So I'm thinking about wound, these unresolved places and things in our trauma and all of that. And then I'm thinking about medicine and all the different resources that are made available. I think now, I mean, is it fair to say, more than ever, the resources for medicine to wound. I mean, in the last 6 or 7 years, 10 years, what's happened in the trauma research and trauma recovery type of procedures. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Mm,
I've seen, as a psychotherapist of 36 years, it dominates. It's dominating the training, which you have to do to even just all the way down to the molecular level of just keeping your credential. Is that you look and you go, oh my gosh! I mean, look at the availability of
mm,
trauma material. So,
mm,
so I'm thinking about, and I want your help with this. I'm thinking about the Bible as medicine. And it sounds to me like we don't have to I don't hear Walter saying, and reality would never hold up to this, that somehow we have to believe in trauma or convince ourselves that trauma is real. We have to do, I think, just the opposite. We have to remove all the barriers to get to there's trauma in all of us. I don't have to decide, oh, I'm going to believe now in trauma. It's like, it's in you. It's in you. So if the Bible's medicine, what do we do with even my brain that at times feels like the medicine is actually exacerbating the wound because of how troubling some of the texts are?
mm,
Uh,
yeah.
People in the Old Testament. I did a podcast recently. The guest, we didn't end up going where I thought we might, but I was just talking about how and nothing against the person I was interviewing, not at all. But I was just talking about how problematic the Old Testament is. And I wasn't really talking about, well, this doesn't line up with this historically. I was just talking about, man, I read some of the, I mean, you're a scholar, and it's like some of the things in First Samuel and some of the things in Numbers and some of the things in Deuteronomy and other passages about what people interpret to be genocide and whatever. And so what do we do with the text seems to not be medicine at that point, but it's actually it's a recording, it's a historical document that we have in front of us of what God actually initiated. And then in my devotional life to God, um, I'm to be close and feel safe. And I know in the therapeutic world, if you don't feel, if you don't create a container of safety, you can't even help a person get to some of those hidden things that they don't know about and maybe will never fully know about. And will disclose some to the therapist, but they're not entitled to. That's what I love what
Mm-hmm.
Walter's getting at there is like,
Mm-hmm.
I, as a therapist, have no right to say, I need to know all of. And in my early days, somehow I was entitled to think, well, I'm entitled to know all of that. Well, I'm not. It's up to a person to decide. I might be able to help them for their own release. I'm going on and on. Medicine wound. What do we do with
Well,
those, Davis?
there's a classic essay from Plato on the pharmakon, which is a Greek word for the wound brought by the word, really, and then that it is the same word as the word for medicine. And Jacques Derrida has this famous reading of the same of this precise issue. Or Kathleen, oh gosh, Kavanagh, who is a constitutional law professor, has a book that is really informed by Walter's
Hmm.
perspective on prophets and prophetic imagination and what does it mean to be a prophet. And her book is on the contributions and importance made by prophetic speech in the history of uh, American
Wow.
legal
I
history.
gotta
Yeah,
I gotta get that
it's
one.
really great, and she compares, she differentiates prophetic speech from uh, deliberative, rational, moral, like moral deliberation, in the sense that when you're speaking prophetically, you're not really debating whether something is right or wrong. You're either calling something out for being wrong, or you're calling people to
Mm-hmm.
do something that you think is right, or that you're
Mm-hmm.
speaking from a place that assumes uh, that what's right will be clear to you and to I, and that we just need to look at. And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, she talks about how important this mode of discourse has been to American legal history, and she compares it though to chemotherapy. She says that it's also uh, risks
Mm,
being poisonous, speaking prophetically. If you try and speak prophetically about
mm,
something that we may have reasonable reason to disagree about, then it is destructive to the social relationship, and it can easily then become ad hominem. As I think you're a bad
mm.
person for having the wrong position about this thing. So
Right,
so the
right.
analogy I think is really good, and in fact Walter read this book and liked this book also, um, and uh, so she says you have to chemotherapy, you need it, it needs to be injected in order to survive something like a
Mm,
cancer, and yet it does great destruction to the body, and it shouldn't be
mm.
overused. It should be used strategically, and so I don't know if that helps, but that gets it, that
Oh, that
chemotherapy
helps
is
so
itself a
much.
kind of poison that you need to heal the social body, and um, that
Wow.
some of the texts can then become difficult and seem to exacerbate the wound may be true, but those texts may also uncover things that you didn't know you were feeling, or those aspects of your hurts and griefs. And Walter was always insistent on
Wow.
not, I mean, he would admit everybody, you can't help but have your favorite texts, your go-to texts, your ones that are more important, your sort of functional canon, but he really was insistent on making sure that you're reading across the canon, because it's often those moments when God shows up that make you uncomfortable, that where something new can be
Mm,
discovered. And
mm. Gosh, Davis, that was, thank
yeah,
you.
thanks
Thank
for the
you.
great
Thank
question.
you. Thank you. That it was more, it was, it satisfied my brain and really touched my heart. Um, and I think I know why. Davis, when a pastor gets up to preach, or you're asked to preach, and you preach prophetically, and then afterwards somebody, and I'm sure this has happened, somebody says, "Can I talk to you, pastor or guest preacher?" Sure, let's have lunch, let's whatever. Very comfortable gathering. There's a warm pastoral presence, hopefully, for the pastor, kind of living two worlds like Walter did, and I think you as well, prophetically and pastorally with warmth and care and gentleness. And then the person says, "Your message hurt me. It hurt me. It disturbed me. Um, it sounded like my abusive father. It sounded like my uh, non-nurturing mother. It brought up all that in me." And let's say the person says, "I take responsibility for what it brought up in me. Do you take responsibility for what you said?" Where does your mind go with that?
I think that's a lot of what the long quotation you read is talking about, how we come to these texts from such different formed
Mm,
places, rooted in hurt and trauma and manifesting in fear, um, and wrapping us up in other communal values and vested interests and so on. And so it is, every teacher, I think, or therapist knows that, like, what you say to your patient or what you say to the students is not going to be what they hear. It is there's going to
mm,
be something else that they hear that you were going to walk away and think, how could somebody think that that's what I said and that's what they think that you said. um,
mm,
and so and I think that that is unavoidable, and the most important thing is to
mm,
be at that table and having that coffee and maintaining that relationship and
mm,
not agreeing with each other, and recognizing that one's words can say things that go far beyond anything that one may have had in mind or intended. And sometimes that is I think a moral failing, but at other times it's simply um, an unintended consequence
yeah.
without, that doesn't need moral judgment attached to it. But if people are sharing their hurts and how they come to a certain message or text with a different set of concerns and or fears or anxieties or whatever, then that's much better than pretending that we're coming at the text from a neutral place, or that's going back to that same quotation, right?
One
That
dimension.
you
All right,
learned
right, right.
from text center negotiation, which is it's not just neglected because it's one of many. It's where he really works out his theory about what is this new epistemological
Mm,
moment that we're in, and how are we supposed to do theology in this postmodern moment where we realize that there's no getting out of language, that there's no God that we have access to outside of the language that we're given, and if
hmm
if you're in the community, right, the biblical text for the biblical God, and he works that all out more fully in his 1997 theology of the Old Testament, as sort of magnum opus. But that,
Jeez,
yeah,
I've
that's
looked at that one.
750 pages, and
That's heavy, man. It's not only heavy with content, but it's like it's
yes,
heavy to lift.
right. That was one of my classes.
It's like, could one man
Yeah,
write this?
he did. He wrote so much. That was my first, one of my first classes at Columbia that first year that I was his student. He taught a whole semester on theology of the Old Testament. We read that book, and it was a wonderful class. It had just been published a few years before. So anyway, that text under negotiation book is good, especially if you have listeners who are interested in the the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings for Walter's theology, and why he thinks that his moment needed a kind of new kind of way of doing theology to
hmm
meet a postmodern uh, moment after the fall of the Soviet Union, and um, after all this post-war French theory had emerged, and post-war German folk thinkers too also influenced
Yes.
Walter. But um, yeah, not nearly as many people read that book, but it is. I think it's a quite important
Okay.
book in his corpus.
And it's still important, isn't it? I mean, not just for history, but it's still important for
Yeah, I
now.
think so.
That's what kind of blows me away from everything that I read of Walter. It's like, th- you wrote this last week,
I know
you
it's
know?
amazing. Yeah, I always find things in things that he says, and he was a really unique and uniquely creative mind.
Hmm. Davis, I'm going to ask this in the spirit of you as a writer and you as a lecturer. So, written word, spoken word. Um, how did Walter influence those? And I'm asking in my mind as how did Walter influence those? And at some point, we set Walter aside and we just have Davis, right? We just have Davis as the writer and Davis as the speaker. But how did it influence what you've become? His writing style or the content or
Yeah,
whatever? What's the first thing that pops in your mind about you as writer? Because you write. I mean, my goodness, man. What's the current book you're working
that
on, by the
is
way?
the book on early Hellenistic period, so the first century after Alexander the Great uh, conquers Persia, and Alexandria is built, and the sort of intellectual center of the Mediterranean world moves from Athens to Alexandria, and from Alexandria they're administering Judea and Jerusalem, and you get this explosion of Jewish literature in this century. When you also have incredible um, intellectual developments in Alexandria, and a new kind of imperial administration, which changes the kinds of text Jews are writing and reading um, in profound ways. So I started working on Ecclesiastes, and that's the century when Ecclesiastes is written, and so then
Okay.
I realized that we needed a more of a historical grounding for understanding this really productive period in Jewish intellectual history. So it's a larger book on Egypt and Jerusalem, Judea, and much more historical than my earlier book, which was on the Book of Job, and really through continental philosophy and some of that
Wow.
post-war French thought that I was referring to earlier. So those are the major influences I think of Walter on me, especially theoretically, was his social critique. He's deeply influenced by
Right.
Marx and
Right.
Marxist thought, which of course becomes lots of different things, and he doesn't endorse all of it, but it was profoundly influential on him, and
hmm
that's what he's talking about when he's talking about vested interests, I think, and the kinds of at the top of the
hmm
zone of, is it Zone of Imagination? Is that what, yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Yes. Zone
right.
of
And
imagination.
then the other big influence on me from Walter is the importance of the Freudian psychoanalytic tradition. And so uh, I just went in ways that differ from how Walter went with engaging some of the more theoretical backgrounds for his work. But I think I'm still deeply like simpatico with those. He really understood how important history and history, materialist history, is for reading and understanding texts and their use um, and misuse and so on, and then for understanding the complex nature of the psyche and the importance of the unconscious,
Mm.
um, and the productive nature of readers who are informed by these approaches. I think in the period when he was working out all of his ideas too. So he really influenced me on kind of theoretical backgrounds. I don't think I write like Walter, but I probably do channel Walter a little bit in the classroom with trying to do the dog and pony show with the
Mm.
undergraduate students to make them think that you know this text Joshua is interesting, or
It sounds like, what was the title of the book that you said was
oh yeah, ice
controversial? You
axes.
mentioned it
Yeah,
early on.
yeah,
Ice pick.
yeah.
You get
Right.
your ice axe
That's
out.
right. Um, so,
Beautiful.
and Walter was very
Beautiful.
dramatic, and he got this from his teacher too in the classroom. If you saw him give lectures, I'm sure, and
Yeah.
he would act out passages, and he would gesticulate in all kinds of ways, and use his glasses and his voice as pedagogical tools. I think to look over them um, and deepen his voice and so on.
Mm. So the
Yes,
performing arts,
yeah, he was prophetic in that way too.
and didn't he?
He
And he
did.
loved
Yes,
theater, right? He loved theater. He loved to
he
go to the
did love to
movies
go to
and
the movies.
whatever.
He
So,
many afternoons. It's like, where did this guy have all this time? He I haven't been to a movie in years, but he was writing way more than me. And
I mean, this is very private, but
I know,
did he sleep? Was he a short
I
sleeper?
don't know how much he slept, but he got up every morning and wrote. And
Dude.
I knew him many afternoons to go to the
Mm.
cinema and see an independent film. And yes, he loved Shakespeare, and he loved to go to plays.
Mm. Wow.
But he was, yeah, and he was very dramatic. His teacher, James Meilenberg at Union Theological Seminary in
Yes.
New York City, was also, I think, similarly dramatic and dynamic in the classroom. So I suppose you pick up on some things that are impactful to you as a student, and you can't help but not do them. But I try not to seem like it's parroting too much.
Yeah. You got to kind of integrate it into where people go, oh, wow,
Right.
Davis came up
Yeah,
with that. It's like, well,
that's right.
maybe so, maybe not. Davis, this has been really, I, this has been a joy. I hope it's been a pleasure for
Yes.
you.
Thank you so much.
Um, I will cherish this. I've learned so much. When will your book be ready? Is that, I know it's kind of a
Yeah,
dangerous
I don't know.
question to,
It has received reviews, and it needs to be edited, and it's co-authored with friend and colleague Brennan Breed, who's at Princeton Theological Seminary. And so
mm,
it's also a matter of us working out when we can start and make those revisions, and then get it back turned back
mm.
in. So most of the research, I think, has been done, but it's hard. Well, especially while I'm directing the center, I've not had a lot of time for
Oh
writing.
man, I'm imagining you by candlelight late at night. It's like, it's 2 in the morning and you're just getting started. But the current research is interesting because I used to give clients of mine a lot of grief about sleep. Sleep's an interesting. I have an interesting relationship with sleep and money, and I have an interesting relationship with sleep because of my mother, and the what she believed about sleep, which was, if you didn't get your sleep, you weren't going out the next day. And then I got issues from my dad about money. So I've got an interesting relationship with sleep. But I would tell people, 8 hours, 8 hours. Hey, I read a recent article. There's a new term for short sleepers. And they found this, you probably know this, they found this within folks working in tech. They kind of use that as their audience, their population to do research. And there's people, and I know somebody that is not in the tech world, and he operates on about 4 hours sleep a night. And I said, man, seriously, John, I mean, like, are you good in the world? And he's like, well, you know me, man. And 4 hours for me, if I get five, I'm like, kind of like eating food. It's like I'm stuffed. But 4 hours is good for me. They say these short sleepers don't need what most of us, and maybe most of us don't really need as much sleep as we get. But I can't imagine with how productive Walter's life was and how productive your
Yeah.
life is. And you have a wife and two. How old are your
16
sons?
and 14.
Wow, right on, man. Well, you hear from an old guy like me. It's like, man, really enjoy
Oh
those
yeah.
times. Mine are 34 and 30. And I said to my older son, he was just here for Christmas, and he's pulling out of the driveway, and I got tears in my eyes. And I'd said to him right before, let me ask you again, who's parenting who? Who's
Yeah.
parenting who? You parent me, man. He's like, Dad, it's all good, man. It's all good. And I'm like, man. So I said to my wife later, it's like, God, he just keeps giving and giving to me and my career and all the things and she's just like, it's time for him not to give back. I mean, that's not the mentality, but
Yeah.
just receive it, you know. But 16 and 14, man, those are
Yeah.
beautiful
They're fun
ages, man.
boys.
Davis, this has
Thank
been
you.
a treasure,
Same.
man. This has been a treasure.
Thank you, Doug. This is great.